So, my chapter in this book was titled On the Place of Life in the Cosmos, Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism and Contemporary Theoretical Biology. Let me say a little bit about myself for those who don't know me. I am an associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco in a program called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And I teach courses there to graduate students in process thought and its applications, mostly Whitehead, but other process thinkers as well. And the applications of process thinking to the natural sciences, the social sciences, the study of consciousness. And I also teach courses on German idealism. So in this chapter, I do a number of things. I try to argue that understanding the possibility of life emerging in this universe requires altering our normal conception of the physical world in line with Whitehead's process relational ontology and his pan-experientialism. And I also engage with some other research programs and paradigms in theoretical biology, in particular, autopoiesis, developed by Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana and carried forward more recently by Evan Thompson. So I'll get into all of that. So I begin my chapter by emphasizing the importance of developing a participatory cosmology. And you could think of this as an attempt to approach these topics with an endo methodology, right? And so when we study the living world, the physical world, even when we do theology, we have to remember that we are inside of what we are trying to understand, right? We are physical beings trying to understand the physical world. We are biological organisms trying to understand the nature of life, right? So scientists are part of the universe they're attempting to know. Seems kind of obvious. But I think this often gets forgotten because of some Cartesian residues, a kind of Cartesian hangover, where dualism is presupposed metaphysically and in practice, even while in terms of the explicit theories that naturalistic scientists develop, they will deny that they are dualistic. But the problem here is that very often scientific explanations of natural processes, whether in physics or in biology, because they take this on this mechanistic character, they end up being incompatible with the fact that organisms like us, conscious agents, in other words, exist. And not only do conscious organisms with agency exist, but these organisms, human beings, are capable of natural scientific knowledge, right? So scientific explanations of natural processes must be compatible with the existence of organisms capable of that knowledge, of that type of explanation. And I think the mechanistic account of physics, of biology, undermines its own conditions of possibility. There are cosmological conditions for the possibility of scientific knowledge, in other words. So that the cosmos is intelligible and capable of being understood at all is one of the metaphysical presuppositions of natural science. Whitehead understood this quite well. Immanuel Kant understood this quite well. But I think we'll see the difference between Whitehead's pan-experiential approach and Immanuel Kant's transcendental approach as we move forward here. The point is that both Whitehead and Kant recognize that there are metaphysical presuppositions of science, right? Whitehead says in the very first few pages of Process and Reality, he says there's an essence to the universe which forbids relationship beyond itself. Now, what he means here, what I take him to mean and try to develop in this chapter, is that when we claim to have rational knowledge, unlike in the Cartesian and Kantian approach, where rational knowledge and mind as such is considered almost to be outside of the natural world, providing us with a kind of view from above, a view from nowhere. And this kind of Cartesian approach to knowledge is a pursuit of a kind of external control over a world that is a material world that is entirely separate from us. When Whitehead says that there's an essence to the universe which forbids relationship beyond itself as a violation of its rationality, I take him to be suggesting to us that rationality, rational knowledge, is in fact a function of relationship. And so when we come to know things, we're really building and maintaining relationships with other organisms. We're building and maintaining alliances with other organisms, right? So a stable fact, a stable understanding of a particular system in the natural world is more a function of how we have come to relate to that system, rather than a matter of determining it as though it were some kind of mechanism with fixed laws that it obeys and so on. We have to come to recognize that the way we approach that which we are trying to know, the way we relate to it, is going to affect how that being, that system, that other organism or community of organisms is going to respond to us, right? And so there's a relational aspect to all of our knowing, and this is part of the very essence of the universe as Whitehead understands it. In my chapter, I draw on the work of Hans Jonas, who, in addition to writing some quite important and influential books on Gnosticism, also wrote this book, The Phenomenon of Life, sort of philosophical biology. And he picks up on both some of the important contributions that Aristotle makes to the study of life, but also Immanuel Kant, particularly in the Critique of Judgment, where Kant develops one of the earliest theories of self-organization to describe the living world. I'll get back to Kant in a moment here. Jonas tells a bit of history in this book, pointing out that for primal peoples, the sort of primal worldview prior to the modern age was animistic, and in this context, because life was accepted as the primary state of things, death loomed as the disturbing mystery. So Jonas thinks that for this reason, the problem of death is probably the first to deserve this name in the history of thought. Now, in Jonas's time, ethologists hadn't observed quite so many examples of other animal species sort of mourning the dead, particularly the mammals, higher mammals, elephants, and primates, some corvids. They seem to at least exhibit behaviors that suggest that they also encounter this mystery of death. But it's clear that this awareness of death is something that higher organisms, it's not exclusively human beings, we can, I think, say with some degree of assurance now, but higher organisms become aware of this fact of death and respond to it. Human beings develop whole cultures, religions, and worldviews in response to this. But as the sort of evolution of consciousness unfolded and the modern European worldview was developed out of the scientific revolution, things became inverted. Rather than life being accepted as the primary state of the universe, with death as the anomaly, after the scientific revolution, as this new mechanistic worldview came to dominate, at least in the Western world, but now increasingly around the whole planet, it was death that was considered to be the norm. Death as the primary state of things, right? The universe is 99.9999% dead stuff, and living organisms, this thin film on at least our planet, might be somewhat different, and some At least one organism among this thin film of biological material, human beings, are conscious, right? But this is the anomaly now in our modern world. And so instead of this question that primal peoples asked and oriented themselves around, what is death, modern people tend to ask, what is life? Life itself becomes the mystery. And I think in our time, it's no coincidence that just as we find ourselves entering the sixth great mass extinction event in the history of Earth, a mass extinction that may claim our own species, it's now that philosophers are once again beginning to take the ontological prospects of panpsychism seriously. Right? It's as though the prospect of mass death has brought the significance of life more fully into view. So in this context, as we face mass extinction, as we face climate change, as we face this ecological catastrophe, I think our study of life, our biological sciences really have to be understood as quite urgent, right? This is an approach to biology as if life depended on it, because there's a sense in which, the mechanistic worldview it's not just an inadequate theory. It's destructive in practice. It undermines the life systems of the planet. We've been imagining nature as though it were just a machine and relating to it in that way. And as a result, we've gone about destroying and undermining the capacity of the community of life on Earth to maintain itself, right? And so part of a participatory approach to these questions is recognizing the interplay between theory and practice. There's a link between the way that we know and our action, in other words, how we behave towards the world. And in order to develop a more organic biology, I think we also have to develop a more organic physics. And Whitehead's philosophy of organism, I think, is up to the challenge here. In his book, Science in the Modern World, he began to develop this picture of the philosophy of organism. He says in this book, the appeal to mechanism on behalf of biology was in its origin an appeal to the well-attested, self-consistent physical concepts as expressing the basis of all natural phenomena. But, writing in 1925, he says, at present, there is no such system of concepts. So in the early 20th century, physics underwent really a series of revolutions, right? You could almost call it the second scientific revolution, as relativity theory and quantum theory emerged to upset the old clockwork picture of the universe. And Whitehead realized quite early on that these new understandings of the physical world, the nature of matter and energy and space and time, required a new metaphysics, that the old mechanistic ontology that had undergirded science since its inception in the 17th century was no longer adequate to the new data and theories to interpret that data that were emerging in the early 20th century. Whitehead felt that the concept of organism, with some minor amendments from how the ancients understood the nature of organism, was more appropriate to understanding non-locality and entanglement and the relativity of space and time than was the old sort of mechanistic view of particles in the void, obeying merely externally fixed laws and exchanging only efficient causes with one another. Whitehead thought that an understanding of organisms engaged in a nexus of relations with one another, having internal relations with one another, was a more appropriate metaphysical backdrop for this new science. So he developed an organic cosmology, and in this chapter, I also show the resonances between Whitehead's approach and that of Friedrich Schelling before him and Robert Rosen after him. Schelling was a German idealist philosopher and philosopher of nature who began developing his philosophy of nature in the late 1790s and into the early 1800s. building on Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment, really, and his understanding in that third and final critique of the self-organizing nature of living organisms. Kant recognized that the Newtonian way of approaching nature as elaborate mechanisms was totally inadequate to and could not, in fact, explain even a single blade of grass. And because of the nature of the circular causality that is at play in even the simplest living organisms, Kant famously said there would never be a Newton of the grass blade because of the way in which living organisms um, seemed not explainable in terms of merely efficient causes. And Schelling picks up on this, as does Robert Rosen. In the 20th century, Rosen says that the universe described by mechanical laws is an extremely non-generic one, and one in which life cannot exist. Far from being a special case of these laws and reducible to them, biology provides the most spectacular examples of their inadequacy. So Rosen is suggesting here that the laws of physics, the mechanistic laws of physics, which are purely efficient in terms of Aristotle's four causes, it's just an exchange of forces between inert particles, say, that this view of the physical world is non-generic, meaning it's too special to account for what he thinks is the more generic form of causation in the natural world, which is on display quite prominently in the biological world. But the idea here is that self-organization is a principle which goes all the way down. It becomes more obvious in the biological world that nature is a series of nested self-organizing processes. But to understand how what we see displayed in the biological world is possible, Rosen thought we need to rethink physics to understand it too in terms of self-organization. And then Schelling, before Rosen, had said this in his book On the World Soul. He says, the particular successions of causes and effects that delude us with the appearance of mechanism disappear as infinitely small straight lines in the universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists. So what Schelling is suggesting here is that rather than thinking of organism or living organization as somehow merely apparent and ultimately reducible to what's truly real in nature, mere mechanisms, Schelling is saying, no, it's the reverse. Mechanism is the appearance. Organism is the reality, right? Which is to say, when we see mechanism, a particular succession of causes and effects, right? Efficient causality, we're not taking in the whole picture. We're too zoomed in, as it were. We need to step back and take in the whole and recognize that there is, as he puts it, this universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists. So like Whitehead, Schelling sees the universe itself as a kind of organism, and that there's a kind of macrocosm, microcosm relationship here. And so it's not that there isn't what you could call mechanical causes operating at various local scales. It's that they're always ensconced within a larger, more all-encompassing organic process. Now, even more recently, in 2018, a couple of philosophers of biology, Jean Dupre and Nicholson, Daniel Nicholson, I believe, edited this text, Everything Flows, Towards a Processual Philosophy of Biology. And it's a wonderful collection of chapters trying to advance this processual approach to biology. And they do mention Whitehead and acknowledge his importance for the development of process thought. But, and this is in their introduction to this collection of essays, they claim that his work is a liability that's best avoided by serious philosophers of biology. Quote, the panpsychist foundations of Whitehead's system, not to mention its theological character, are hard to reconcile with the naturalistic perspective. So naturalism here, I think, is what I would refer to as a kind of closed naturalism. One could, and many have, including David Ray Griffin, have argued that Whitehead's philosophy of organism is still naturalistic, but it's a kind of open naturalism, you might say, open to the possibility that experience goes all the way down, and open to purpose, or this urge, as Spiridon was describing it, that also goes all the way down. Um, this is still a naturalistic picture, and Whitehead even has this process theology that I think recognizes um, the natural world as imbued with a kind of cosmic eros that is just a natural part of how creation occurs moment by moment in individual actual occasions, rather than being an imposed sort of teleology that some kind of deistic picture, as Newton had. Whitehead imagines God as part of the world, and the world as part of God. So it's a strange kind of naturalism, perhaps, but I think Whitehead is still offering us a naturalistic picture. But the problem with the kind of closed naturalism that Dupré and Nicholson are defending here is pointed out by Jonas, who thought that Whitehead's philosophy of organism offered one of the only reasonable alternatives to this kind of closed naturalism. Quote, after the loss of the transcendental counterpole provided by dualistic metaphysics, in whose shelter alone an unadulterated materialism in physics was rationally possible. So what Jonas is suggesting here is that the kind of closed naturalism that says, no, there's no experience in nature, there's no purpose, there's no eros or urge in nature, that this kind of closed naturalism actually presupposes, at least implicitly, a kind of Cartesian dualism, right? As if the mind of the knowing scientist was not properly part of nature, but just a neutral outside observer, right? So to understand life in this closed naturalistic way, as empty of intrinsic purposiveness, as devoid of experience until some magical level of complexity is passed, it's still residually Cartesian, right? It depends on this transcendental counterpole provided by dualistic metaphysics, as Jonas puts it. A participatory approach to these questions, as I introduced earlier, requires just totally inverting this transcendental picture so that mind becomes ensconced within things themselves, right? Rather than there being any room for an outside observer to peer into the universe from beyond. We have to put ourselves, our scientific inquiries back into the universe. And I think Whitehead's pan-experientialism allows us to do that. And so in that sense, it's more naturalistic than this closed, residually dualistic quasi-naturalism, or pseudo-naturalism, let's call it, that even Dupré and Nicholson, despite the wonderful work that they're doing, continue to presuppose. So to move on now to the autopoietic approach to biology, I was quite lucky to be exposed to Matrana and Varela's work and Evan Thompson's work as an undergraduate when I was studying cognitive science. And their approach to understanding the nature of life, I think, is still quite powerful and provides much in the way of resistance to mechanistic reductionism in the life sciences. I mentioned a few sessions ago Francisco Varela's last paper with Andres Weber titled Life After Kant. And in that paper, they draw on Whitehead a little bit and try to establish the reality of purpose in the living world, right? Not as Spiridon was suggesting, not as a mere as if or a description that human beings are projecting onto the living world, but no, really, organisms are purposeful creatures in and of themselves, right? So Varela and Weber write, on a material, concrete level, we can observe in the organism the flip side of mechanical causality, a final causality, as the basic process of life itself, the establishment of an identity. But this happens not by revising physical laws for particle interactions in special application to organisms, nor by imposing an extra mechanical entelechy. It is rather the subject pole that is the organism in its autonomy, which changes linear causality by structuring matter in the process of self-realization to maintain itself as this very process. Right? So an autopoietic system is not only a self-organizing but a self-producing system, right? Who has that produces a membrane that defines itself over and against an environment. And as we'll see on the next slide here, this account of the autonomy of organisms, I think, is something like what Whitehead means by the self-creation of actual occasions of experience on the metaphysical level. But I worry that autopoiesis, in fact, leaves us with a kind of naturalized monadology, similar to Leibniz's view of monads that were windowless, right? Because as we'll see, I think there's a kind of new kind of dualism that autopoiesis introduces. The dualism between mind and life is, I think, overcome brilliantly, but there's a new dualism between life and matter, as we'll see. Now, in his more recent work, Evan Thompson, who was a student of Varela's, has recognized this remaining gap, even if the gap between mind and life is overcome such that, even single living cells are understood as cognitive systems. There's still this gap between neutral physics and chemistry, as Varela and Weber refer to it, and the purposiveness of life. But Thompson has been coming closer to a kind of pan-experientialist perspective, or at least neutral monism, as he says in his book, Waking, Dreaming, Being. Physical being and experiential being imply each other and derive from something that is neutral between them. And he has a new book coming out early next year that I know draws probably on Whitehead more than any other figure. It's co-authored with Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser, both physicists. And I'm very excited about this text, The Blind Spot, Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience. And so over the years, I've seen Thompson come closer to, as a result of studying Whitehead, come closer to the sort of position I'm going to put forward here, which I see as not in conflict with autopoietic biology at all, but a kind of ontological or metaphysical supplement to it. So to further unpack what I was describing before, this is the picture of autopoietic biology that comes out of Varela and Maturana's work. And this quote here that I've highlighted comes from the Life After Kant paper, where Varela and Weber write, organisms can be said to transcend the neutrality of pure physics to create their concern. Only their concern for life. Only this organic perspective actually has the status of world. Only this is real, because the living can only act in the form of such an intentional world. Life is thus always subjective in the strong sense of the word. So what's depicted here, these circles are organisms, right? And within the organism, as a result of the self-producing network of processes, a kind of subjective concern arises, right? So the organism's purpose is to maintain itself. It is concerned with maintaining itself, surviving. And these internal dynamics are described as operationally closed, which is to say the normal approach that objectifying science would take to the study of life is to say, well, there are inputs and outputs, right? So the sensory organs, or in the case of simple cells, just the membrane, is receiving stimuli from the environment. Some kind of mechanical process happens inside to respond to that stimulus and produces an effect, motor action, say. Now, what the autopoietic perspective points out is that everything going on inside of this self-producing organism has a kind of operational closure, such that the most you can say about its relationship to the environment is that it is perturbed by the environment, but how it responds to that environment is totally dependent on the ongoing dynamics internal to that organism. Now, obviously, organisms are related to their environments, and the term structural coupling is used to understand how organisms co-evolve with their environments and other organisms, of course. But it's a bit like Leibniz's monads in the sense that, this relationship of structural coupling to the outside world of merely neutral physics is not exerting a causal influence, at least in the sense of something informational, something that is relevant to the subjective perspective of the organism. That subjective perspective brought forth by the autopoietic dynamics of the organism is closed really to any influence, informational influence to the outside. And so it's a kind of solipsistic picture, I would suggest. Now, how does this differ from the process relational ontology that Whitehead gives us, that I think can provide some supplement to autopoietic biology? Well, for Whitehead, first of all, it's organisms all the way down, right? There is no realm of merely neutral physics that would not also be imbued with experience to some degree, of some lesser intensity, right? And so rather than this realm of just neutral physics that precedes life and having to explain this new gap, even if the mind-life gap is closed, and cognition is equivalent to autopoiesis in the autopoietic approach, there's still this new gap, right, between life and neutral physics. In Whitehead's view, it's organisms all the way down, and these organisms are, through their physical prehensions of one another, internally related. But even while they're internally related, at least to the actual occasions in their past, they're still self-creating. Whitehead will point out that contemporary actual occasions of experience occur in causal independence of one another, right? And so there's elbow room for self-creation, even while each newly emerging occasion of experience remains internally related to every creature to come before it, right? And so you get this nexus, or this network of relations to the past, even while in the present moment of concrescence, there's a self-creativity, there's an ability, as Spiridon was pointing out, for the mental pole of actual occasions to ingress novelty, to not be determined by any root of physical inheritance in their past. And so this is the major contribution I hope I can make in this chapter, which is to both affirm some of the core insights of the autopoietic approach, while also overcoming this residual dualism between life and neutral physics. I think Whitehead's philosophy of organism provides the missing ontology for autopoietic biology, which without that missing process relational ontology remains basically a transcendental point of view on life. So that's all I have for you. Let me stop sharing my screen here. All right. Thank you, Spiridon. Thank you, Richard, in the background, making all of this work so seamlessly. And thanks to the Cobb Institute. And thanks for everyone for turning out, for your attention, for your questions. This has been a lot of fun.